A popular question often considered by fans of George Orwell's 1984 is if Winston's lover Julia faced her own ordeal in Room 101. Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we shall attempt to riddle this out. The question as to whether Julia faced her own worst thing in the world is certainly answerable. Sadly, in the last chapter of the novel, Winston recalls meeting Julia for the last time, though both former lovers are very different people. Little to nothing of the former inquisitive and intellectual Winston remains, and Julia too is noticeably changed both physically and mentally. Quote, "Her face was sallower, and there was a long scar, partly hidden by the hair, across her forehead and temple. Her waist had grown thicker and, in a surprising way, had stiffened." Winston furthermore compares the rigidness of her body with that of a corpse he had helped to drag out of some ruins during a rocket bomb attack, thinking it was almost like stone. In addition, any affection she had had for him had been replaced by contempt and dislike. The key bit of information then comes a few words later when she mirrors Winston's own desperate pleas during his own ordeal in Room 101. Quote, "Sometimes," she said, "they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, can't even think about. And then you say, 'Don't do it to me, do it to somebody else, do it to so-and-so.' And perhaps she might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick, and that you had just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself. All you care about is yourself," he echoed. "And after that, you don't feel the same towards the other person any longer." "No," he said, "you don't feel the same." This dialogue makes it quite clear that Julia had to face her own ordeal in Room 101, though an intriguing point to highlight is that she does not specifically confirm it was Winston who was the only person in the world who could take her place. She confirms she betrayed him, but this is vague and may not be meant in the same way Winston betrayed her in his Room 101 experience. Of course, this could also simply be put down to awkwardness, shame, or mere indifference. However, another tantalizing possibility is that there was another person, even dearer to her, that was her only means of escape. Personally, I don't think this is the case, or at least I like to believe that it isn't. What is remarkable too is that, unlike Winston, who has been largely emotionally denuded by this stage, Julia does retain something of her so-called inner mind or spirit. She does have somewhat of an emotional, albeit negative, reaction to looking at Winston. The more subtle sign of emotional depth is in the description of her as they both sat together, in which she moved her feet a few centimeters and deliberately crushed a twig. This seems to betray nervousness or awkwardness, which seems confirmed in the subsequent language of her words to Winston. I think, then, that so-and-so is very likely to be Winston, though, of course, the possibility remains there was another lover or loved one closer to her than Winston. Julia, then, has clearly endured her own time in Room 101 and betrayed Winston during her interrogation at least. However, now we come to the trickier question of what exactly is for Julia the worst thing in the world. Surprisingly, perhaps, this too is actually quite answerable. There are subtle hints earlier on and in the last chapter itself that indicate what Julia fears most. Firstly, we must consider Julia's reaction to O'Brien's words back in Chapter 8 of Part 2, during the meeting in which O'Brien is apparently inducting both her and Winston into the Shadowy Brotherhood. O'Brien takes it for granted that Winston speaks both for himself and her. In what may be a standard initiation process, O'Brien proceeds to ask Winston what he'll do for the Brotherhood, which includes murder, forgery, and sabotage, among other things. Most shockingly perhaps, O'Brien even asks if Winston would be willing to throw sulfuric acid into a child's face if it was somehow necessary, to which he also assents. The one thing Julia herself objects to is a potential order for her and Winston to permanently part, to which she passionately objects. Winston, after some effort, agrees. It is at this point that O'Brien addresses Julia herself, pointing out that it may become necessary to physically alter Winston through surgery, even adding that they sometimes amputate a limb for good measure. It's at this point that Winston notes that, quote, Julia had turned a shade paler so that her freckles were showing. It's telling too that, despite this, she still faced O'Brien boldly, murmuring something that he took as assent. This isn't much, of course, but it is enough. Furthermore, while this could be coincidence on Orwell's part, it's also telling that Julia's reaction to surgical alteration provokes a similar reaction to at least 3 other party members that we know were ordered to room 101. Firstly, there was an unnamed female party member who Winston recalls being consigned to room 101 sometime after the removal of Parsons from his cell. She reacts to her fate by shriveling and turning a different colour. A second and more memorable instance was the reaction of the skull-faced man later on in the chapter. Already starved close to death, this character is clearly a foreshadowing of Winston's own physical state later on in the story. When sentenced to room 101, quote, the man's face, already very pale, turned a colour Winston would not have believed possible. It was definitely, unmistakably, a shade of green. Finally, and if the former 2 examples are not exactly the same reaction, we do have a direct link with none other than Winston himself. In Part 2, Chapter 4, while Winston and Julia are in their hiding place above Charrington's shop, his reaction to the appearance of a rat is to drain of colour in a similar manner to Julia later in O'Brien's office. Julia notes, quote, Dearest, you've gone quite pale. What's the matter? Do they make you feel sick? Rats, of course, are Winston's worst fear. Even if the previous comparisons are not convincing, and they are, then this direct connection must be. Of course, as with other issues, we cannot be 100% certain. However, the connection is there, and given this, we can reasonably assume that surgery, or more specifically, disfigurement, perhaps, is Julia's worst thing in the world. If you recall too from earlier in the video, there is another crucial bit of information we have that all but confirms this. Winston noted a long scar across her forehead and temple. Of course, this could have feasibly been due to injuries sustained in some other part of her interrogation. Winston too, after all, suffered physical changes not associated with room 101 specifically, such as the loss of his teeth and hair. However, it's hard to believe that Orwell would add such a detail arbitrarily. This incidentally opens up a further possibility that Julia did better than Winston in facing her fear. Winston, of course, was driven near mad just by the threat of the rats itself, the beasts not physically touching or injuring him. Julia, by contrast, has been scarred, which suggests she was either too slow to grasp what she had to do, that is, put another in her place, or more admirably, that she resisted to the point that she was cut. Sadly, given what she reveals, and also considering that she has not been significantly disfigured beyond this scar, it's almost certain that she, like Winston, was ultimately broken in room 101. Another point worth highlighting too is the information O'Brien gives us. Though it's perfectly possible he was lying to further demoralise Winston, according to him, Julia, unlike Winston, was a textbook conversion, with her coming over to the party quickly and instantly betraying him. I'm in 2 minds about this. On the one hand, this does seem feasible, given who Julia is. Julia is younger than Winston and O'Brien. She's from a generation that has grown up with the party and implicitly accepts it as permanent and perhaps even legitimate in a way. Julia's own rebellion is quite different from Winston's, in that it was always personal and sexual in nature. Julia is not an intellectual dissident, and where a point of fact does not touch upon her own life or pleasure, she is utterly uninterested in it. We see this in her apathy to who Oceania is at war with, or on who invented particular things. When Winston announces he has the book and insists she read it, she again expresses disinterest, suggesting he read it aloud instead, after which she quickly falls asleep. The point then is that, in terms of the principles of INGSOC, or playing the part of a good party member at least, Julia has little trouble. She effectively is already orthodox, and may even have a love of Big Brother of some kind. Of course, this is not to suggest Julia is not a thought criminal of any kind. She is, and has committed multiple sex crimes. However, unlike Winston, there is much less intellectually wrong with her. Given this, it's easy for me to believe that O'Brien was thus sincere that Julia was generally easy to convert back to the fold. On the contrary, however, given we earlier saw signs she had actually resisted Room 101 longer than Winston, and assuming he was her person to put in her place there, was O'Brien therefore only speaking in half-truths? Yes, she was easy to bring back into the fold generally, but as we've seen, she did love Winston. It was she who passionately objected to parting with Winston in the meeting after all. Perhaps both lovers of 1984 had inverted and opposite success, if we can call it that, in resisting the party. Winston was a difficult case, standing out against the pain of torture, taking some time to be intellectually and emotionally moulded, whereas Julia quickly came through the process but proved emotionally resistant to giving up Winston in Room 101. This is all, of course, speculation on my part. What I think we can say then is that Julia, firstly, did endure Room 101, secondly, that her particular fear was disfigurement, and finally, that she perhaps resisted longer than Winston. A final point that may seal the deal, so to speak, for some listeners is to simply consider Julia's personality and motivations. As noted before, Julia's opposition to the party is not political or intellectual. Julia enjoys sex and perhaps the thrill of her affairs too, both things the party happen to forbid. This fact is significant for our purposes today, and it ties in with her greatest fear. For Julia, given she is young and attractive, traits that feed into her love for sex and pleasure, facial disfigurement is a sure way of affecting this. As Winston noted on Julia, for her, everything came back to her own sexuality, and when this was touched upon in any way, she cared. Possible permanent disfigurement, then, is perhaps her worst fear, as to become permanently unattractive strikes at the very core of her purpose for life and her joy of living. It stabs right at the heart of her identity. So, that was Julia and her likely worst fear in Room 101. What do you think? Was Julia confronted by facial disfigurement in Room 101? Tell us your own thoughts or objections in the comments. Meanwhile, please consider liking the video if it was plus good, and if you thought my analysis here was double plus good, then consider subscribing and hitting that bell button to be informed of future videos from the channel and to prevent YouTube from consigning 1984 lore to the memory hole. And remember, you know what is in Room 101. Everyone knows what is in Room 101.